Okay, I'm here with Ami Palmer, who's a graduate student here at BGSU, and we're talking about his dissertation, which is how science denialism and conspiracism undermines democracy. Um, so we're just going to start out with some background information on the types of what idealization is and the two types specifically.
Okay, so I guess before we talk about idealization, we need to just um, put it in the contemporary framework of democratic theory. So most people, whether they know it or not, subscribe to the view called political liberalism. And what that means is that rather than having the state decide how people ought to live their lives and the values by which people um, should live their lives, we let individuals make those choices themselves. And so the state's not going to tell you what religion to choose. The state's not going to tell you what conception of the good life you should choose. The state's not going to tell you what moral ethic code you should choose. So this is distinct from, maybe sometime like 17th century and before, pre-Locke, where the state made all these decisions. And so, but along with political liberalism comes what's called the problem of disagreement. Well, if we all live by different moral values and different religions and different conceptions of the good life, inevitably we're going to disagree on things. And so we need to figure out partly how to reconcile those disagreements, but on issues where we need some sort of public solution, where not everybody can get their way, we need to have some sort of mechanism or account of how it is that a solution would be justified. And one way of thinking about this is what's called the principle of public justification. So what this means is that for any law that you are subject to, so any coercive law that you are subject to, in order for it to be legitimate, it has to be justified to you in some way. Now, different democratic theories disagree over what it means for that law to be justified, like what justification means. But I'm going to work within a framework called public reason liberalism, which has an account of justification that incorporates something called idealization. And let's just back up and work with an example. So we want, suppose there's a bylaw that after say 10 o'clock you can't have a certain level of noise. Right now, of course, some people like to stay up late, and that's their lifestyle, the values they've chosen, and so they want to have a party. And other people, they work at 6 o'clock in the morning, they want to go to bed early. So we have disagreement over what the law should be, and now whatever that law is, everybody's going to be subject to it. And so the principle of public justification says that everybody has to see some sort of justification for following that law in order for it to be justified. And so we might have the recalcitrant individual who's like, no, I want to party all the time. Ain't no government gonna tell me when I can and can't party, right? So we always have, there will always be people that at a superficial level won't recognize the reasons for a law. And so because, and also people can just have false beliefs, people can have been misled, people can make bad inferences, people can lack full information. There's all sorts of reasons why it's not a good idea to take people's face value beliefs. And so what we want to do is add a level of idealization to their beliefs. And what this means is we're going to ask the question, what would this person believe about the policy if we cranked up the dial on the rationality a little bit, gave them a little bit more information, and eliminated some of their errors in thinking? Then would they see justification in this law? And so, yeah, idealization is exactly that. Is we ask the question, okay, would this person believe that the law is justified if we corrected their cognitive errors and informational deficits? Now, within idealization, there are various accounts of how much we should idealize people. So famously, John Rawls, who is the granddaddy of this method, he thinks that when we ask questions about basic principles of justice by which we should order our society, that we should ask, what would people endorse if they were fully rational and had full information? And he has some other conditions attached to that, but for our purposes, we don't need to know that. So he says so if you took every person in that political community and made them fully rational and gave them full information, corrected any cognitive errors, it would actually be the case that we would converge on certain principles of justice, okay, depending on whether you're reading this earlier or later writing. Now, some philosophers think that it's a mistake to fully idealize agents, because what is the whole purpose of idealization? Is to justify a coercive law that I'm going to be subject to me, not some hypothetical, fully rational, fully informed agent. I'll never be that person. And so even though you might tell me that that's what I would want if I were fully rational and fully informed, if you could even do that operation, I will never recognize the reasons for the law as being my own. And so for that reason, some people propose what's called moderate idealization. So we're just going to clean up some of your more superficial errors and failures of reasoning, and then we're going to put a limit on how highly we can idealize you. And that limit is set by whether you, by reflection, would recognize the reasons being attributed to you by the idealized model of yourself. If you can't recognize those reasons as coming from your own values and beliefs, then we've idealized you too far. And the law is not publicly justified to you. And so it's not legitimate. And so we need a different law. Because for the public reason liberals, for a law to be justified, it has to be justified to each person that's subject to it. So that kind of concludes the main brushstrokes of a theory of idealization.
So it's really a byproduct of putting the onus of policy into the people. You run into problems of when their beliefs contradict with even public health, with the vaccines and stuff. Obviously, you can't get everyone in a room and talk about and explain to them their rational failings, but you have to still make policy. So that's kind of where the intersection.
And so, it's in a way it's really weird that we're asking people in a democracy, that we're asking people for what they think on certain complex policy issues
Yeah.
where they have virtually no knowledge, and if they,
It's
and
not
if
their job. They don't
it's
get
not their
paid
job to
for
know yet somehow we're consulting them. And so this is why it's important to get beyond just people's initial superficial beliefs. And this is why we think idealization is important, because we want to know, okay, would this policy or would this law accord with someone's values and beliefs if we kind of cleaned up their epistemic shortcomings.
So what exactly is the standard that you measure, like what's reasonably justified for a particular person or particular viewpoint, rather?
Okay, good. So this is going to depend on the particular model of idealization that you pick. So I'm going to talk about Kevin Vallier's model, which is based off of what's known as the Pollock-Harmon model of idealization. Basically, you have an agent's core set of beliefs and values, which we can just kind of call their worldview. And then we want to make sure that whatever policy we propose is acceptable to their worldview after idealization. And so this type of idealization this model of idealization puts constraints on how far we can idealize. So if a particular policy looks like it's going to violate someone's core beliefs and values, then that policy proposal has to be rejected because it's not going to be justified to that person. Really, the core idea is that any political coercion has to be justified to the person being coerced. Right? Otherwise, it's just authoritarianism, right? And which is contrary to our democratic values. Right? And so, so on the Harmon-Pollock model of idealization, the upward constraint of how far we idealize, or how far we can go to determine whether a policy is justified or not, depends on the content of an agent's core beliefs and values.
And you mentioned this in your dissertation. It's kind of compartmentalized where there might be contradictions within the core value and some peripheral values. So you really are trying to value what they're identifying as the most, right?
Right, good. Yeah, so all human beings have contradictory beliefs. We might not realize it at the time, but if someone could go into our head and like list all our beliefs, we'd find some that contradict with each other. And so if we're not fully idealizing, the question becomes, well, okay, I believe X is true, and also somewhere in my head I believe X is false. The moderate idealizer has to tell us, well, how do I decide which of those to keep? Because I can't keep both. Right? Either I attribute to this agent that X is true, or I attribute to this agent that X is false. Right? And I can't just be like some random way to do it. I need some systematic way to do it. And so what the Pollock-Harmon model tells us to do is, well, you look at the location of that belief in that agent's areas of concern. Right? If it's in their core areas of concern, if like X is true is in their core areas and X is false is in their peripheral area of concern, then we idealize away X is false and we preserve X is true. If both are in the peripheral areas, then we're just going to attribute to them whatever we think the correct view is. And if they're both in the core areas of concern, then at least Valier says that we don't revise it. We allow contradictions in people's core beliefs, because the idea is that beliefs that are at people's core are action guiding. It kind of determines how they live their life. And if we attribute to someone a policy that is inconsistent with the way that they live their life, then the reasons for that policy won't be recognizable to that person, and therefore it won't be justified to that person. And so we have to reject it as a possible policy.
Do we want to go into now whether it should be an empirical filters, and why empirical is probably at least as justified as normative?
Good, yeah. So pretty much all of the literature on idealization and public reason has to do with what's called normative disagreement. This means disagreement about values. What do we do when people disagree about values? How do we idealize them? And how do we come up with laws that are going to be justified to people with diverse values? Now, what I want to focus on in my dissertation is, well, it looks like there's a lot of disagreement over empirical matters, meaning observable facts about the world. Right? So disagreement isn't just about normative values, it's also about facts. And so one way we can approach this is just say, well, we're going to handle disagreement about facts the same way we handle disagreement about values. But I want to say is, no, these are different kinds of beliefs, and there's different standards of justification for normative beliefs and for empirical beliefs. And so I don't think they should be treated the same way when we consider policy making and when we think about idealization for policy making. So I'll just briefly just kind of give you a brief sketch of some of the important differences I think there are. So we think with values, like, how do I know if a value is true? Like, if I think that going to church is a good thing, how do I measure that? How do I verify the truth of that claim? Or I say abortion is wrong. Right? I say something like that. How do I verify the truth? There's no like beaker and Bunsen burner I can use that will tell me whether it's true or not. Whereas facts about the world, I can get my microscope out and get my beaker out, can do some experiments, put my lab coat on, and I can test to see whether, do vaccines cause autism? Let's run some studies. There are objective ways of answering that question. This is not to say that I'm not proposing moral relativism here or moral nihilism. I'm just saying that there's no obvious way to verify the truth of moral claims.
It's not as black as white.
Yeah, and even if everybody agreed that moral values or moral claims can be true or false, rather than just a matter of opinion or preference, even if we all agreed, we would probably all disagree on what makes those claims true or false. Whereas it's not the same case with empirical beliefs. Like we all agree that either it's true that the Earth is flat or that the Earth isn't flat, right? There has to be an answer to the question, and we all kind of agree on like what the standards of evidence would be to verify the truth of the claim. But yeah, it's not true when it comes to normative claims. Now, why does this matter? Because there's another disanalogy with normative and empirical claims, and that has to do with experts. We recognize that there are certain communities that are experts in certain domains of empirical knowledge. So if I want to know about physics, well, there are people that study that, and I can learn stuff about physics by talking to physicists. If I want to know about the chemical properties of something, I can talk to a chemist. They will know better than a plumber or a mechanic, right? If I want to know about how cars work, I'll talk to a mechanic or something like this. So we recognize, just even in our everyday life, and also just when we're trying to just learn about the world, that there are communities of experts for each domain of empirical knowledge. But this doesn't seem to be the case when it comes to moral knowledge, right? It seems like, even though some people might say that there are moral experts or groups of moral experts, so some people might think like the Pope is a moral expert, like if you're Catholic, or if you know, mostly happens in religious groups. People will say, "Oh yeah, this body is a group of moral experts, so I'm going to get my moral guidance from them." But the thing is, there's no universal recognition of who the experts are in the moral domain, whereas everybody agrees that the physicists know the most about physics, the mechanic knows the most about how to fix the car, the plumber knows the best about how to fix the toilet. Right? So there's universal agreement. So we don't have a further problem of disagreement when we're trying to mitigate a disagreement over facts.
And yeah, it's the basis of division of labor. I mean, like, you're going to have one group that is more proficient at something than another, and if you're going to make policy about that field, you should, like, consulting the exact opposite of that. It doesn't really make sense at all.
Exactly right. So this is why I think it's important to look at empirical disagreement differently from normative disagreement, right? So in normative disagreement, we kind of give equal weight to everybody's view, but I don't think we should be doing that when it comes to empirical disagreement. So people can disagree over the age of the Earth, or the shape of the Earth, or whether vaccines cause autism, or whether GMOs cause cancer. But it's just really weird to say that everybody is equally an expert on these questions, when we have experts that study these questions. And so, well, in the moral case, it seems like it's reasonable to give everybody's view equal weight. It doesn't seem reasonable to do this in the empirical domain. I think there's a fundamental failure to recognize the social division of labor on knowledge. I mean, this is why we have universities. Right? It's kind of like, we're going to fund all these universities and experts, but then we're just going to completely ignore what they have to say when we don't like it. Yeah, and we're not going to ask them. Like, that something's gone wrong.
Just burning money.
Yeah.
A big pyre.
Yeah. So anyhow, that's kind of what I think about why, in idealization, we need to give greater weight to epistemic experts.
You really get into kind of paternalism in that you're deciding what's right based off judging by the normative, what they think should be the case is honoring their values better than what they believe about climate change, right? So
yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is the problem, right? In our model of democratic values, we don't want to subject people to coercive laws they don't see their own reasons in for adopting those laws or for following those laws. And so we can imagine the hardcore climate change denialist or the hardcore anti-vaxxer, if they're subject to a law that, let's say with vaccines, right? If the anti-vaxxer is subject to a law that requires mandatory vaccines, it seems like they're being coerced, right, against legitimate authority. Right? They don't recognize the reason in the law. And in the case of the climate change denier, if we have like a carbon tax, like, well, I don't recognize the legitimacy of this law because you're telling me it's to alleviate global warming, but global warming isn't happening. So this is a stupid law, right? And that it makes sense, right, from that point of view.
Yeah.
And this is why I don't think we should give equal weight. This is why I don't think legitimate policy requires we give equal weight to everybody's empirical beliefs, because people can just be wrong. And even if that belief exists at the core of somebody's worldview. So there are people for whom it's core to their worldview that global warming isn't happening. So they're like right-wing evangelicals. They just say, well, God would never do this. God had the flood, and he said after that he would never do anything bad like this, right? And so therefore it's not happening. Or, you know, you don't need to go the religious route to make that argument, but you know, there are people that believe that capitalism can't cause bad effects, right? Or disastrous effects, and so this can't be happening because that would mean that there's a problem with capitalism, or unfair market. So therefore, it's not happening. And so their worldview is guiding their empirical beliefs. And so there's a tension in our model of democracy. On the one hand, so we're faced with a choice. Either we allow policy to be built out of false beliefs, right? If we want to respect everybody's empirical beliefs, even if they're at the core, or we have to apply laws to people that would coerce them somewhat, that they don't see the reason in. And I think that it's permissible to apply laws to people that are coercive if that coercion arises out of them having demonstrably false empirical beliefs, or at least probabilistically false empirical beliefs. And I draw the line in this way. If what you believe is counter to a consensus of experts in a mature natural science, then the political process doesn't need to take into account your beliefs, because the policy-making process shouldn't be held hostage to beliefs that are, by any reasonable account, false.
You're right. Do you want to get into exemptions in this case?
So here, it's really important for me to distinguish between policy making and then what we do after the policy is in place. So when I'm constructing policy, when I'm looking at what are my policy alternatives, that should be guided by the best science. Okay? And it should not take into account views that run counter to a consensus of relevant experts in a mature natural science. Okay. Now, it doesn't follow from that once I've selected my policy that's based on the best science, that I won't allow exemptions to it. Okay. So vaccines don't cause autism. I'm going to have, for the most part, a blanket mandatory vaccine policy. But I may allow some exemptions. And I can ask different questions about how broad or narrow those exemptions are going to be. But the policy itself, you know, when I decide what my policy should be, should I allow, should I have a mandatory vaccine policy? That should be guided by science, right? Now, with the question of exemptions, so there are going to be a lot of different competing values that are going to guide our thoughts on this. So one thing is, okay, what is the cost to society of allowing exemptions, right? So now, for herd immunity, for most vaccines, you need about 92% compliance, which means that you can allow 8% non-compliance. It's actually probably going to be less than that because non-compliance tends to cluster in certain communities, right? And then so whatever your exemption policy, it needs to take into account that you lose herd immunity once you have more than 8% non-compliance. That's just one of the factors. So one thing is, like, what's the cost to society of allowing exemptions? If it's fairly trivial, right, you allow it, right? The other thing is, like, what is the cost of the social norm and ideas of fairness of allowing exemptions, right? So we can imagine a carbon tax based for global warming. And Joe pickup truck says, no, I want to drive my V12 engine pickup truck.
Joe pickup truck.
And you're like, okay, but we're just going to apply a carbon tax to you because you're consuming X number of whatever fuel or. He's like, well, actually, I don't believe that global warming is a real thing, so I want an exemption. So now we built our carbon tax policy based on the best science. We didn't incorporate Joe pickup truck in deciding our policy. Okay, but then we have a separate question about exemptions, right? So, and we ask, okay, what's going to be the cost of allowing Joe pickup truck to not pay the carbon tax? But we also have the question of like, what does it do to people's ideas of fairness and people following the social norm if we allow exemptions? Because if some people, if paying the carbon tax, most people see it as onerous, and then we allow exemptions, then other people are they're gonna stop wanting to pay, and it's gonna destroy the norm of following the rules. So we have to weigh all that. But I guess like my main point, so I'm not gonna go into particulars about how we decide who gets exemptions. I'm just going to outline kind of the different costs that we have to consider when we make these choices. But my main point is that when you're actually constructing the policy, when you're choosing from your various policy options, you don't need to include the people who have aberrant views. Okay. Once you've chosen your policy, it becomes a separate question whether we're going to allow exemptions or not, and to whom.
And even that's determined by science, like only allowing 8% in the herd immunity case. Even that's still determined by the scientific consensus.
That's right, yeah. So. Or like or religious views. Like if somebody doesn't want to go to sex ed, maybe they can opt out of it or something like this. But we've determined that scientifically, based on studies, that teenagers have reduced rates of teen pregnancy if we give them sex ed, and reduced STI transmissions. But if you come from like some religious household where they don't think you should talk about sex or whatever the reason is, okay, we're gonna let your kid opt out. But we constructed the policy based on the best science. Right?
Okay.
We didn't let your views that abstinence only works determine our policy for what we're gonna do when it comes to sex ed for kids.
So practical implications.
Okay, so we've been talking exclusively at the level of theory. So now I want to talk about how do we fix this? I mean, we have this kind of epidemic of widespread science denialism and conspiracism, which makes public policy making in a democracy really difficult without being coercive. Right? And we want to avoid coercion whenever we can. So part of the solution comes from recognizing the root of the problem, right? And the way I've come to see it is that the root of the problem is that there's a lack of trust in certain epistemic institutions and government institutions. And that's important because most of our knowledge from the world comes from other people. So, when I want to learn about the stars or about biology, I don't build my own laboratory or planetarium in my backyard. I read some books on it from people that are experts. But here's the thing, is that if I don't trust somebody, then the words coming out of their mouth or the words that they write in the book don't count as knowledge. Mm-hmm. And so I can only get knowledge from people that I trust or from institutions that I trust. Otherwise, it's just empty words. So why is it that conservatives disproportionately deny the existence of anthropogenic global warming? Well, on one account, they just don't understand. That actually turns out to be false. Conservatives actually understand the science quite well, and they can answer the questions.
And
about,
wasn't
about the science.
one of the stats that college-educated Republicans disbelieve it higher than
That's right.
than high school educated?
Yes, which is, yeah, we can talk about why that is as well. But so what's going on? Well, conservatives see universities as liberal institutions. Therefore, the scientists working in those institutions are liberal. And conservatives don't trust the liberals. Just like liberals don't trust what conservative institutions say. Right? When the Heritage Fund comes out with some study on how reducing taxes is going to increase jobs and help poor people, most liberals kind of like roll their eyes. Right? And so what's going on is like the exact same thing from the point of view of conservatives, is that they're seeing the liberals saying something that they don't like, and so they're rolling their eyes. They don't trust the institution, and so it doesn't count as knowledge. And then so the solution is very obvious at the level of theory anyway. We need to reestablish trust in the legitimate institutions that merit trust. And this is in some ways it's a big challenge, and in other ways it's doable. So on campus, across universities surveyed, the ratio of self-identified liberal professors to conservative professors is 4 to 1. So this means that this is across all departments. So obviously, like in the business department, it's going to be less. In like gender studies department, it's probably going to be more. But if you average across all departments and across a whole bunch of universities in different areas, it's 4 to 1. That's pretty big, right? Conservatives are outnumbered 4 to 1 in academia. So you can see why they might have legitimate reasons for distrusting from their worldview the information that's coming out of these institutions. So we need to reestablish trust. So how do we do that? Well, my thoughts are you need something like Jeffersonian democracy. And what Jeffersonian democracy is that citizens are involved in the workings of democratic institutions. And so if you have conspiracy theorists who are really distrustful of government, probably they have legitimate reasons for it and illegitimate reasons for it. Well, what you do is you ensure that government institutions have civilians that are participating in the processes, in the policy-making processes, in even day-to-day stuff. Because if you or your uncle or your cousin is working for, let's say, the EPA, it's a lot harder to say that they're like this evil organization out to ruin businesses or whatever it is. Or if you have a cousin or you work on some civilian oversight committee for the FDA, it's a lot harder to say that they're like out to get people to, they're like preventing cancer drugs from getting in the market, or they're trying to give people drugs that will make them sick so big pharma can make money, right? Like you're in the institution, or someone that works there, and that person isn't an evil person. This helps to reestablish trust. Another important thing will be, on campuses, I think they need to be try to be more ideologically heterodox. They need to. This sounds funny. They need affirmative action for conservatives.
It's come to this.
Yeah. No, I know. I just know some people are going to lose their shit when I say this, but
I mean, really, the denialism is, as you touched on a little bit, but the denialism is really just a function of power. Mostly, the conservatives are so undermined in institutions that they just have a natural distrust towards.
Yeah, and that's normal. I mean, we distrust, as someone who leans liberal, I distrust the Heritage Fund whenever anytime they publish anything.
Yeah.
Right? I just think, well, they just picked the conclusion that they wanted and then just like stuck in data points to get what, right? So I think academic institutions need to try to get more conservative leaning people in their institutions. Need more balance than that. You might say, no, it should be, you want the best people in there. I'm not saying, I'm advocating the same kind of policy that you would have in any kind of affirmative action. It's, you have to, it's just that when the two people of equal qualification are in contention for a job, you take the one that's the minority view.
Which really that's fair, because the two views will actually get to have basically conversation with each other, and then both will get more fleshed out views because of that.
Yeah, and I just think that the cost of having basically half the country distrust scientists is so huge that, like, whatever the costs are of getting more conservatives into academia, those costs are much smaller than the cost of having half the population disbelieve scientific conclusions.
And the whole reason that you have to implement a empirical filter is because of this. So if we could rather restore trust than have to discredit people based on
policy then becomes less and less coercive.
Yeah.
Right, and more justified to more and more people. And so I think just from the point of view of what we want out of a democracy, those types of policies are going to get us moving in that direction. And like I said, so for me, like, the most difficult challenge is how to do this with federal level government. Because I think it's really easy to see how Jeffersonian government works at local, municipal, or county level government, possibly state level government. We can see how citizens might be involved in different government institutions there. But how this happens at the federal level, I don't know. I just want to say at this point, like, here are the principles.
I'm just a theory man.
Yeah, I'm just telling you what the theory is. I'm going to hand it over to the political science department to figure out, like, how to actually do it. But yeah, these need to be the guiding principles.
Well, the basic idea is to, on the ship that is the United States, get everybody so to speak, a handle on the reins, and to see that they can veer it left or right, or that they can actually do it, and it's not, when you figure out how the sausage is made, it's not actually that terrifying.
Yeah, or if it is, if you actually join the process, then you can mitigate that.
Yeah. Right?
Because now your weight is felt. I guess, like, yeah, if I could, like, really summarize my view, it's that trust isn't built at a distance, right? If the fundamental problem is trust isn't built at a distance. So we need citizens. We need to close the gap between our institutions and citizens. So that's kind of like how I would summarize the view.
So now, the last part we were going to was
expert made policy.
Yes. So why is it a problem that we just say, hey, I have a great idea? why do we even have politicians? We can just, if these experts have so much knowledge, why do we just let them make all the policy decisions and just let them make everything right?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. There are two answers. There are more than two, but I'm going to give two answers. One has to do with what we've been talking about, which is the nature of democracy itself. Right? So the more and more distance you have between the citizens and the institutions, the more and more distrustful, I think, citizens become of government, to the point where government becomes dysfunctional, which is what I think is the situation now. I think there's so much distance between citizens and their government that they really don't trust it. And so governance and policy making becomes almost impossible. So that's number one. It's just like the consequences of doing it that way make governance and political community and democracy really difficult. The other one has to do with the nature of policy itself. So anytime we're choosing one policy over another, we're not just looking at we're looking at different outcomes. And deciding between different outcomes is a question of value. It's not a question of empirical facts about the world. So anytime there's a question of value, it seems like democracy requires that the public be involved. Because the public has to, we want the values of the public to be represented in the policy that's chosen. Otherwise, in what sense is it democratic? And so this is another reason why we don't just have little purely, policy that's written purely by experts, because they're going to have to weigh certain values in selecting possible policies. But why is it that the expert values get to push out, any democratic values, right? And so it seems like, we want the values that guide policy selection to, in some way, be tied to the values of the people that are going to be governed by those policies.
So you need someone to weigh normative values with empirical value.
That's right.
Empirical facts, basically.
That's right. Yeah. So those would be like the two main answers to that question.
Yeah, the whole, just from the perspective of having to ignore people's opinions based on something because they're not right, like that's, I feel like you can only make policy that long before someone's like, no, you're not making those decisions for us anymore. We're really tired of that.
Well, it ceases to be democratic.
Yeah.
Right. There's no more self-rule. Right. It's now just somebody's telling you how to live your life.
Yeah.
You don't see the reasons in the policy. Right. It's just totally foreign to you. Like, what's the difference between that and dictatorship?
Yeah. Really, it's just a dogmatic view. It's a dogmatic belief in the wrong people, really. I was thinking about this. It's a lot of people do have dogmatic beliefs, but they just choose the right people, like the right experts in their empirical field. Which is not to say that it's wrong to be dogmatic in pretty much any sense, but when you're choosing the right people, you don't have to worry about it.
Exactly right. Yeah. So there's this in social anthropology. There's this model, Boyd and Richardson model, of how ideas are spread through a population. One of the variables is was at the population model is the prestige bias, right? So people follow the views of people with high prestige. Where knowledge is difficult to come by, so like stuff that is like requires expert knowledge, right? People defer. So when it comes to scientific issues, people are going to defer because they're not scientists, right? Mm-hmm. The question is, who are they deferring to, right? So what the Boyd and Richardson model shows that people are going to defer to what is like a popularity bias and also prestige bias, right? So that's why like celebrities have so much clout, because they have prestige, right? Could be for the wrong reasons, but this is just like at the population model. This is like what happens, right? And so what's going on with some groups is, because of their set of values and norms, they're misidentifying who the relevant experts are, because in their community, person X has prestige, right? Maybe if you're an Alex Jones follower, like you're like, you have like your values or worldview are such that you're extremely distrustful of government, and so who has prestige in that worldview? It's Alex Jones. So who are you gonna defer to on complex issues that you can't get the information for yourself? You're gonna defer to people like Alex Jones. He has high prestige, right? And this is just how humans function. This is is well verified, as a population model for explaining how ideas spread through groups and through populations.
You tell me I shouldn't get my political thought from Ted Nugent.
Probably not. I guess I would just conclude in kind of a summary, which is that the way we get to know things is through other people, but we can only the people that we acquire knowledge from are only those that we trust. Because people we don't trust, they can talk all they want, but we don't take their claims to be knowledge. And so I think it's just a good, maybe reflective exercise for each person to think about who they trust and whether that person is genuinely worthy of that trust for the type of knowledge you're getting from them. Or is that person a non-expert in that field where they're giving information, or they're giving you what you think is knowledge? And then think about, well, who are the legitimate authorities or experts on this topic? And what do they think? Yeah, so I know for me, like I try to reflect on that a lot, especially when it comes to economic stuff, because I have my views on what would be fair distributions of goods, and sometimes in economic theory runs up against what to me would be like the intuitive way of getting what I think is a just distribution of goods. And so I need to think, okay, well, what's the consensus of experts in economics on this, if there is one, right? And if there is one, why do I think that my view, I did undergrad economics, but why do I think that my undergrad view of economics is gonna more likely to be right than a consensus of people who have devoted their lifetime to studying this problem?
You really have to just be humble.
Yeah, it's a really bad bet. Right. So, as much as it hurts, I found myself revising my views on economic stuff. It's hard to fight it because we all have our normative commitments and ideas about what we think would be just, but and how to get there. But sometimes those turn out to be false.
It's easy to vet people based off of political ideologies. It's too easy to do that. And
that's right, but that's kind of how we're wired.
Yeah.
Right, evolutionarily, that's how we do it.
It's a bit of tribalism that is.
Because who are you going to trust? The person who has the same values and beliefs as you, or the person who has different values and beliefs from you?
Yeah.
Makes perfect sense. You're going to trust the person with the same values and beliefs, even if they're not an authority on that topic.